Elderly woman forced off plane. 10 minutes later, what happens next shocks everyone. An elderly black woman boards a flight, excited to see her great-grandchildren, but her encounter with a prejudiced flight attendant sparks a shocking series of events. What happened next not only transformed her life, but also changed an entire airline. Stay tuned to discover the powerful journey of resilience, justice, and kindness that shines beyond discrimination.
The soft morning sunlight streamed into the lively Arcadia Airport terminal as Mrs. Evelyn Grant, a graceful elderly black woman in her late 70s, stood patiently in line, ready to board a flight she had eagerly anticipated for months. Clad in a modest yet elegant outfit, a charcoal gray dress, a cream cardigan, and her cherished pearl necklace, Evelyn exuded a quiet dignity that reflected her years of wisdom and resilience. Her neatly styled silver curls peeked out from beneath a small hat, and her aged but steady hands held onto a leather handbag, a treasured memento from her late husband. This trip was a milestone for Evelyn. It was her first flight in decades, and the first time she'd get to visit her great-grandchildren in person. The anticipation filled her with a blend of joy and nervous excitement. Flying wasn't a common occurrence for Evelyn, and this was her first time experiencing the luxurious amenities of Solaris Airways, a premium airline her son had insisted on booking for her. "Mom, you deserve to travel in comfort," he had told her. Although Evelyn hesitated at first, she ultimately accepted his thoughtful gesture, grateful for the opportunity to travel with ease instead of enduring the strain of a long bus ride. As the boarding process commenced, Evelyn observed the crowd around her, an assembly of well-dressed passengers. Their fleeting glances and hushed murmurs didn't escape her notice, but she had long since learned to rise above such subtle judgments. Her focus remained on her ticket, row 2A. She smiled faintly, pleased with the idea of sitting near the front of the plane. When Evelyn's boarding group was called, she stepped forward with measured grace, unfazed by the hurried pace of those around her. Handing her ticket to the gate attendant, she offered a warm smile. The attendant scanned the ticket, hesitated briefly, then forced a polite but strained smile. "Enjoy your flight, ma'am," she said in a flat tone. Evelyn chose to brush it off, focusing instead on the excitement bubbling within her as she entered the jet bridge. The aircraft's interior shimmered under soft lighting, its polished surfaces and plush seating exuding luxury. Evelyn was captivated. This was a world far removed from her everyday life, a rare indulgence that she allowed herself for this special occasion. She had spent a lifetime prioritizing others, and now, finally, she was embracing a small moment of comfort for herself. As she reached her seat, 2A, a window seat, Evelyn paused to admire the spacious cabin. Gently placing her handbag on the floor, she reached for her modest carry-on to stow it in the overhead compartment. Before she could lift it, a sharp voice cut through her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am," came the voice of Diane Monroe, the lead flight attendant. Her tone was clipped and authoritative. Evelyn turned to see a tall, impeccably dressed woman in her late 30s wearing the signature Solaris Airways uniform. Diane's expression was unreadable, professional but distant, with an undertone of irritation. "Is this your seat?" Diane asked, her eyes scanning Evelyn as if questioning her presence there. "Yes, it is," Evelyn replied calmly, holding up her boarding pass. Diane leaned in, scrutinizing the boarding pass with narrowed eyes before giving a terse nod. "Fine," she said curtly. "Please stow your bag quickly so we can keep the boarding process moving." Evelyn reached for the overhead compartment, her movements slower than the younger passengers around her. Her hands trembled slightly, not out of frailty, but from the nervous energy of being in such an unfamiliar environment. Diane crossed her arms and let out an audible sigh, her frustration obvious enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. "Do you need help?" Diane asked, her tone making it clear that offering assistance was the last thing she wanted to do. Before Evelyn could respond, a man seated nearby stood up with a kind smile. "I've got this, ma'am," he said, gently taking the bag from her hands and placing it effortlessly in the overhead compartment. Evelyn smiled warmly, gratitude shining through her expression. "Thank you, young man," she said softly. Diane's face darkened, her expression souring. "Let's not hold up the line," she said sharply, before stepping back. her voice carrying an edge that made several passengers glance in Evelyn's direction. As Evelyn settled into her seat, she noticed the subtle glances from others. Some were curious, others indifferent, but a few seemed distinctly uncomfortable with her presence. She focused her gaze forward, her hands resting calmly on her lap. Evelyn had long learned not to let the opinions of others dictate her self-worth, even when their disapproval was palpable. Diane, however, seemed intent on making Evelyn feel unwelcome. As she walked up and down the aisle, her eyes darted toward Evelyn with an expression that was hard to read, but far from friendly. Evelyn tried to focus on the joy awaiting her at the end of the journey, the warm hugs of her great-grandchildren, their laughter filling the room, and the stories she would share with them about her life. Yet the cold attitudes of Diane and some of the passengers weighed on her. Evelyn had faced prejudice many times in her life, and though she had always risen above it, each instance carried its own sting. What the other passengers didn't know was that this quiet elderly woman possessed a strength far greater than their assumptions. Unbeknownst to everyone aboard, Evelyn's presence on this flight would spark a series of events that would transform the airline forever. As the cabin crew prepared for takeoff, Diane's focus remained firmly fixed on Evelyn. From the moment Evelyn had stepped onto the plane, Diane's demeanor had been cold and dismissive. It wasn't just her clipped tone or the way she avoided eye contact. It was the air of superiority Diane carried, as if Evelyn were an unwelcome disruption to her meticulously ordered world. Once the passengers had settled into their seats, Evelyn noticed that her seatbelt wasn't fastening properly. Wishing to ensure her safety, she pressed the flight attendant call button. Moments later, Diane appeared, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she approached Evelyn's row. She stopped abruptly, her expression as impatient as her tone. "What is it now?" Diane asked, her voice tinged with irritation. Evelyn met her sharpness with a kind smile. "I believe my seatbelt is stuck. Would you mind helping me?" Diane let out a loud sigh, clearly exasperated, making sure her annoyance was audible to those seated nearby. She leaned in, fiddling with the belt for only a second before straightening up. "There's nothing wrong with it. You just need to pull harder," she said flatly. "Thank you, dear," Evelyn replied graciously, adjusting the belt herself. Diane turned on her heel and strode away, muttering under her breath, "Special requests already. This is going to be a long flight." Her words, though spoken quietly, carried a sharp edge of disdain. A few minutes later, Evelyn realized she had forgotten to take her medication before the flight. She hesitated briefly, knowing that Diane's attitude made her an unapproachable figure, but Evelyn's health was more important than avoiding potential conflict. Resolute, she pressed the call button again. This time, Diane returned with an even more pronounced look of irritation etched across her face. Her posture stiff and her expression one of thinly veiled annoyance. "Yes," Diane asked curtly, crossing her arms. "I'm sorry to trouble you," Evelyn said softly, "but could I have a small cup of water to take my medicine?" Diane let out an exaggerated sigh, her irritation unmistakable. "We're not even in the air yet, ma'am. Water service will start once we reach cruising altitude. You'll have to wait." Evelyn, maintaining her calm demeanor, tried to explain. "It's just for my medicine, dear. I promise I won't bother you again." Rolling her eyes, Diane muttered, "Fine," before disappearing into the galley. When she returned, she practically slammed a small plastic cup of water onto Evelyn's tray table without a word. The loud clatter caught the attention of nearby passengers, several of whom exchanged disapproving glances or shook their heads. Evelyn, however, remained composed. She thanked Diane softly, took her medication, and tried to settle into her seat. But the tension in the air was palpable. Moments later, Diane returned, this time accompanied by another flight attendant. Standing over Evelyn with her arms crossed, Diane projected an air of authority. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said loudly, drawing the attention of other passengers. "Are you sure you're in the correct seat? This section is reserved for premium passengers." Evelyn looked up, calm but confused. "Yes, I'm in the right seat. My ticket says 2A. She held up her boarding pass for Diane to inspect. Diane snatched the ticket from Evelyn's hand, her lips tightening as she examined it closely. After a moment, she handed it back. "Well, it looks like you're in the right seat," she said grudgingly. But next time, please make sure you're boarding with the correct group. It's important to follow procedures. Evelyn blinked, unsure why Diane felt the need to lecture her. I did board with my assigned group, she replied softly. Diane didn't respond. Instead, she turned to her colleague, muttered something under her breath, and walked away. Evelyn caught snippets of her words. Doesn't belong, and slowing things down, and her heart sank. Prejudice was not new to her, but it still stung every time. The final straw came when Diane returned yet again, this time addressing Evelyn in a tone that was condescending, as though speaking to a child. Ma'am, you need to keep your handbag under the seat in front of you at all times, she said firmly. Evelyn, who had already placed her bag securely under the seat, looked up in confusion. It's already under the seat, dear, she said gently. Diane glanced down, realizing she was wrong. Instead of admitting her mistake, she said, Well, just make sure it stays there. I'll be checking. Around Evelyn, passengers began to whisper, clearly noticing Diane's behavior. A young woman seated across the aisle leaned over and said quietly, Don't mind her, ma'am. She's been like this since we boarded. You're doing nothing wrong. Evelyn gave the woman a grateful smile, but the weight of Diane's hostility lingered. It was clear to her, and to everyone watching, that Diane had singled her out, treating her with unnecessary and hurtful disrespect. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Evelyn closed her eyes and took a deep breath, determined not to let Diane's actions ruin her trip. She reminded herself of the purpose of her journey, to visit her great-grandchildren, the source of her pride and joy. Their warm hugs and excited chatter would make any discomfort worth enduring. But Evelyn had no idea that this was just the beginning of Diane's behavior. As the plane ascended into the sky, Evelyn tried to lose herself in the breathtaking view outside her window. The fluffy clouds below and the endless expanse of blue above were mesmerizing, a welcome distraction from the tension in the cabin. She focused on the joy awaiting her at the end of the trip, imagining the tiny hands of her great-grandchildren reaching out to hug her. Yet, even the beauty outside couldn't entirely erase the unease she felt. Diane, meanwhile, began her rounds with the beverage cart. Passengers seated ahead of Evelyn were served swiftly, their requests met with professional, if slightly robotic, efficiency. But when Diane approached Evelyn's row, her demeanor shifted once more, her irritation simmering just beneath the surface. While Diane greeted most passengers with warm smiles and polite, "Thank you for flying with us," her demeanor changed sharply as she reached Evelyn's row. Her previously professional attitude melted into something noticeably cold. "Excuse me," Evelyn said softly as Diane approached. "Could I please have a small cup of water?" Diane stopped, narrowing her eyes slightly. "Water?" she repeated, as though the request was unreasonable. "Yes, dear, just a little," Evelyn replied, her tone polite but resolute. Diane placed a hand on her hip, her expression hardening. "Ma'am, this isn't a charity," she snapped, her voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The cabin fell silent for a moment as heads turned toward Evelyn's row. Evelyn felt her cheeks flush, but she maintained her composure. She had faced moments like this before, and knew how to meet them with quiet grace, even when the sting of humiliation was sharp. Diane's cutting words hung in the air, rippling through the cabin like an uncomfortable echo. Several passengers exchanged glances, their faces showing varying degrees of shock and disapproval. A middle-aged man seated behind Evelyn muttered, "That was uncalled for," loud enough for Evelyn to hear. Evelyn lifted her gaze to Diane, her kind eyes tinged with sadness. "I'm sorry if my request inconvenienced you," she said softly. "I just need to stay hydrated for my health." Diane didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned to her colleague and, in a voice dripping with sarcasm, said, "Apparently we're running a water drive now." She chuckled at her own remark, but the tone was pointed and cruel. Before Evelyn could reply, a small voice from across the aisle broke the tense silence. "Here, you can have my water." Evelyn turned to see a young girl, no older than 9, holding out a half-full bottle of water. The child's big, innocent eyes radiated genuine kindness. "I don't need it," the girl added earnestly. Evelyn's heart swelled at the gesture. Smiling warmly, she reached for the bottle. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said gently. "You're very kind." The girl's parents, seated beside her, smiled at Evelyn and nodded in approval. Diane, meanwhile, froze, her jaw tightening as the interaction unfolded. Her face reddened slightly as she noticed the growing support Evelyn was receiving from the passengers. "Let's keep the aisle clear," Diane barked, shoving the beverage cart forward without another word. Evelyn twisted the cap off the bottle and took a small sip, the cool water soothing her dry throat. She placed the bottle carefully on her tray table, her hands steady despite the emotional turbulence of the moment. "Are you okay, ma'am?" the girl's mother asked, leaning across the aisle. Evelyn nodded, offering a warm but faint smile. "I'm fine, thank you, and thank you for raising such a thoughtful little girl." The mother's smile widened as she gently patted her daughter's hand, pride evident in her expression. But Diane wasn't done. Her frustration only seemed to grow as she noticed the small acts of kindness directed at Evelyn. She resumed her duties, but her movements were harsher, her tone sharper, and her glances toward Evelyn more frequent. It was clear that she resented how Evelyn's quiet dignity and the passengers' support were undermining her attempts to make Evelyn feel unwelcome. The tension in the cabin was palpable, but Evelyn refused to let it shatter her composure. She leaned back in her seat, turned her gaze to the window, and allowed the endless blue sky to calm her. She reminded herself of the joy waiting for her at her destination. She had faced adversity before, and she knew that kindness and patience often triumphed in the end. What Diane didn't realize was that her actions were not going unnoticed. Several passengers, disturbed by her behavior, had begun quietly documenting the incidents. Their phones captured snippets of her dismissive tone, sharp comments, and pointed hostility. While they didn't know Evelyn's full story, they knew this was more than just poor service, it was targeted mistreatment. And they weren't going to let it slide. Diane's treatment of Evelyn was not just dismissive, it was unfair and deliberately targeted. Yet Diane remained oblivious to the growing storm she was unwittingly creating. Her irritation with Evelyn seemed to intensify with every passing moment. Evelyn's calm demeanor, the whispered support from other passengers, and the young girl's kind gesture of offering her water, all of it seemed to unnerve Diane. She couldn't bear that her attempts to demean Evelyn were met with quiet resistance and, worse, compassion from others. Frustration boiled over as Diane stood near the front of the cabin, glaring down the aisle at Evelyn, who sat quietly, gazing out the window. To Diane, this was unacceptable. Her inflated sense of authority convinced her that she needed to take drastic action to reassert control and eliminate what she saw as a problem passenger. With a determined stride, Diane marched down the aisle, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She stopped abruptly in front of Evelyn's row. "Ma'am," she said loudly, her voice slicing through the ambient cabin noise, "I need you to come with me, now." Evelyn turned her head, startled by Diane's abrupt tone. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Diane crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a tight line. "You've been causing a disturbance since you boarded this flight," she declared. "I've given you multiple chances to follow instructions, but you've refused to comply." A murmur spread through the cabin as passengers exchanged puzzled and concerned looks. They had seen Evelyn's polite demeanor and Diane's repeated hostility and knew the accusation was baseless. "I don't understand," Evelyn said, her brow furrowing. "I haven't caused any disturbance. I've simply been sitting here, minding my own business." Diane's tone grew sharper, as though raising her voice might lend credibility to her claim. "You've been pressing the call button unnecessarily, disrupting my duties, and now you're refusing to cooperate. This behavior is unacceptable." Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but Diane turned on her heel before she could say a word. Striding briskly to the front of the plane, Diane picked up the intercom and addressed the pilot directly. "Captain," she announced, "we have a passenger in 2A who is being disruptive and non-compliant. I'm requesting immediate removal before takeoff." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers began voicing their objections. "She hasn't done anything wrong," said the middle-aged man seated behind Evelyn. "This is ridiculous," muttered another passenger, shaking her head in disbelief. A young woman in business attire pulled out her phone and began recording the unfolding scene, determined to document what she believed was an act of blatant injustice. But Diane ignored the mounting dissent. Moments later, 2 airport security officers boarded the plane, their expressions serious. Diane gestured toward Evelyn with a satisfied smirk. "That's her," she said smugly. Evelyn's heart sank, but she refused to let her emotions show. With quiet dignity, she reached for her small handbag and stood up. The security officers approached her, their voices gentle but firm. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," one of them said. Evelyn nodded, her chin held high. "Of course," she replied softly. Turning to the passengers around her, she offered a small, apologetic smile. "I'm sorry for any inconvenience," she said, though she knew she had done nothing wrong. As she made her way down the aisle, escorted by the officers, several passengers voiced their support. "This isn't right," one man shouted. "She didn't do anything," added another, his voice filled with indignation. The young girl who had given Evelyn her water tugged on her mother's sleeve, her wide eyes filled with concern. "Mommy, why are they taking her away? She's so nice." Her mother leaned down, speaking softly but firmly. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people are treated unfairly, but don't worry, we'll make sure this doesn't go unnoticed." Evelyn walked down the aisle with grace and poise, her head held high, even as Diane stood at the front of the plane with a self-satisfied smirk. To Diane, this was a victory, a way to assert her control and rid the flight of someone she believed didn't belong. What Diane didn't realize was that her actions had been closely observed. Several passengers had recorded the entire incident, capturing her hostility, Evelyn's calmness, and the glaring injustice of the situation. When Evelyn stepped off the plane, the airport security officers guided her to a quiet seating area in the terminal. One of them, noticing her composed yet weary demeanor, said gently, "Ma'am, we're just following protocol. If you'd like to file a complaint, we can help you with that." Evelyn nodded, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Thank you," she said simply. Meanwhile, back on the plane, Diane began preparing for takeoff, oblivious to the storm that was rapidly brewing. She had no idea that the passengers who had witnessed her behavior were already planning to report her actions. And she certainly didn't know that Evelyn was far more than the modestly dressed elderly woman she appeared to be. Diane's smug satisfaction would not last long. In mere minutes, everything was about to change. And not in the way she expected. As Evelyn sat quietly in the airport terminal, her thoughts were a mixture of sadness and reflection. She had never been one to demand respect or create a scene. Her life had been guided by dignity, patience, and grace, but even she couldn't deny the sting of what had just happened. With a soft sigh, she reached into her small handbag and retrieved her cell phone. For a moment, she hesitated, staring at the screen. For years, she had chosen to live a humble life despite her son's remarkable success. Evelyn loved him deeply and was immensely proud of all he had achieved, but she had always avoided using his name to gain favor or special treatment. This time, however, was different. Evelyn dialed a number, her fingers steady and deliberate. The phone rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "Vaughn?" said Marcus Dillard, the CEO of Stellar Skies Airlines. "Is everything okay? Shouldn't you be on your flight by now?" Evelyn's voice was calm, though touched with weariness. "No, son," she replied softly. "I've been removed from the flight." A sharp intake of breath crackled on the other end of the line. "What? Removed? Why?" Evelyn hesitated, not wanting to upset him, but she knew he needed to hear the truth. "The flight attendant," she began, her tone measured. "She didn't like the way I looked, I suppose. She claimed I was causing a disturbance. It was humiliating, but I didn't argue. I just left." There was silence for a moment before Marcus's voice returned, low and controlled, but brimming with anger. "Mom, are you serious? This happened on one of my planes?" "Yes," Evelyn replied. "I didn't want to cause trouble, but I thought you should know. This isn't just about me, it's about how people are treated. That woman Diane, I believe her name was, shouldn't treat anyone this way." "Diane Monroe," Marcus repeated, his voice sharp. "I'll handle this immediately. Mom, are you okay? Where are you right now?" "I'm fine," Evelyn assured him. "I'm in the terminal, waiting near gate 14. "I'll call you back," Marcus said, his tone firm and decisive. As Evelyn hung up, she felt a mix of emotions. She hated the thought of her son being upset, but deep down, she knew that this moment had the potential to spark meaningful change, not just for her, but for anyone who might face similar mistreatment. Meanwhile, in Stellar Skies Airlines control room, chaos was unfolding. Marcus's call to the operations team sent shockwaves through the staff, setting off a rapid chain of events that would soon turn the situation on its head. As Marcus Dillard's call came through, the senior operations manager, a no-nonsense woman named Claire Reynolds, picked up the phone. "Good evening, Mr. Dillard," Claire greeted him, her tone professional. "Not so good, Claire," Marcus snapped. "I just received an alarming report. My mother, Mrs. Evelyn Dillard, was mistreated and forcibly removed from one of our flights. I need an explanation. Now." Claire's face went pale. "Your mother?" She stammered, her fingers already flying over her keyboard to pull up the flight records. "Yes, my mother," Marcus confirmed, his voice sharp. "Of course you weren't aware. She deliberately keeps her connection to me private to avoid any special treatment. But that doesn't excuse what happened. I need to know who was responsible, what was said, and why this wasn't escalated to me immediately." "Yes, sir," Claire replied, her voice trembling slightly. Within moments, she had the flight logs and crew details pulled up on her screen. "It seems the lead flight attendant on that flight is Diane Monroe," she said cautiously. "She reported your mother as being disruptive and requested her removal before takeoff." "Disruptive?" Marcus growled. "Anyone who knows my mother knows she's the furthest thing from disruptive. What else?" Claire hesitated. "Several passengers filed complaints against Diane during boarding and even recorded videos of her behavior. I'm pulling the footage now, but early reports suggest Mrs. Dillard was treated unfairly." "Unfairly doesn't even begin to cover it," Marcus said through clenched teeth. "Send me everything. I want those videos, the passenger complaints, and Diane's entire personnel file on my desk immediately. Also, notify the ground crew. I'm on my way to the airport. Have security detain Diane Monroe when the flight lands. I want to speak with her personally." "Yes, sir," Claire replied, already coordinating her team as they scrambled into action. As Marcus ended the call, he took a deep breath to steady himself. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, calm, measured, and full of grace, even in the face of humiliation. He knew she wouldn't want revenge. But this wasn't just about her. It was about ensuring no one else would ever have to endure such blatant discrimination on one of his flights. Grabbing his phone, Marcus dialed another number. "I want a full review of our employee conduct policies," he barked to his legal team, "and I need recommendations for immediate changes. We're setting an example starting today." Meanwhile, back at the airport terminal, Evelyn sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. A few passengers who had witnessed the incident approached her, offering words of support. "I'm so sorry for what happened," a young woman said gently. "I've already sent the video I took to the airline. They need to know this isn't okay." Evelyn smiled warmly. "Thank you, dear. Kindness like yours gives me hope." Little did Evelyn know that her son was already setting plans into motion. Plans that wouldn't just address the injustice she had faced, but would also shake Stellar Skies Airlines to its core. Diane's smug smile, her dismissive attitude, and her abuse of power would soon come back to haunt her in ways she couldn't have imagined. As the luxury flight prepared for takeoff, Diane strutted down the aisle, inspecting passengers with exaggerated confidence. Her smug smile remained unshaken, as though she had just rid herself of a nuisance. To Diane, this was a victory, a reassertion of her authority. Her satisfaction, however, was short-lived. Just minutes before the plane was scheduled to depart, Diane's name was called over the intercom. "Miss Diane Monroe, please report to the front of the cabin immediately." Diane frowned, confused but still confident. She walked briskly toward the front of the plane, where two uniformed security officers waited for her. One of them gestured toward the open door leading back to the terminal. "Miss Monroe," one of the officers said firmly, "we need you to step off the plane with us." "What? Why?" Diane demanded, her tone sharp and defensive. She glanced at the pilot, who avoided her gaze, then at the other flight attendants, who exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. "This isn't up for debate," the officer said firmly. "Please come with us immediately." Diane huffed in frustration but complied, muttering under her breath about how ridiculous the situation was. As she stepped off the plane, she was met with a group of people waiting for her in the terminal. Among them were members of the airline's legal team, the operations manager, and standing at the center with an air of authority, was Marcus Dillard himself. Diane's confidence faltered as she recognized the CEO. For a moment, she hesitated, but she quickly composed herself. In her mind, she had done nothing wrong. "Mr. Dillard," she began, her voice laced with forced politeness. "I'm not sure what's going on, but I have a flight to manage." Marcus raised a hand, cutting her off instantly. His expression was cold, his eyes sharp with anger. "Miss Monroe," he said in a low, controlled voice, "do you have any idea who the passenger was that you removed from this flight?" Diane blinked, momentarily confused. Well, she was causing a disturbance. She was being difficult, refusing to follow instructions. Marcus interrupted her again, his tone icy. "That disturbance, as you call it, was my mother." Diane's face drained of color. "Mother?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Mrs. Evelyn Dillard," Marcus said, his words cutting like steel. "The woman you humiliated, mistreated, and falsely accused of being unruly. And I'm here to ensure that you face the consequences of your actions." Diane's confidence crumbled completely. She opened her mouth to protest, but Marcus didn't give her the chance. "Do you think I'd rely solely on my mother's account?" he continued, stepping closer, his glare unwavering. "No, Diane. I've reviewed security footage from the boarding gate, listened to passenger testimonies, and watched multiple videos recorded by those on board. Every piece of evidence confirms that your behavior was not only unprofessional, but also discriminatory and cruel." Diane's hands trembled as she tried to muster a defense. "I was just following protocol, sir," she said weakly. "She was being disruptive and I thought—" "You thought wrong," Marcus snapped. "You singled her out based on her appearance, refused to assist her, humiliated her publicly, and then escalated the situation to have her removed. That's not protocol. That's prejudice." Diane's eyes darted around the terminal, searching for an ally, but there was none. The legal team stood in stony silence, the operations manager looked disgusted, and the security officers stood firm, waiting for Marcus's orders. "I have zero tolerance for behavior like yours," Marcus declared, his voice firm and final. "You have not only embarrassed this airline, but also tarnished its reputation and caused harm to an innocent woman. As of this moment, you are fired. You are to hand over your ID badge, uniform, and any airline property immediately." Diane's mouth fell open, and she stared at him in disbelief. "Fired? But I've been with this airline for years. You can't just—" "I can," Marcus interrupted, his voice as cold as steel. "And I will. Your years of service don't excuse this disgraceful behavior. You have no place here." Diane's protests grew frantic. "But sir, please, I didn't mean to." Marcus raised his hand again, silencing her. "This conversation is over," he said. Turning to the officers, he added, "Escort her out of the terminal. Make sure she doesn't set foot on another one of our planes." The officers moved forward. One held out a clipboard. "You'll need to acknowledge your termination," he said curtly. Diane's hands shook as she signed the form, tears of anger and humiliation streaming down her face. Diane handed over her ID badge and uniform jacket before being escorted out of the terminal, her head hanging low, a shadow of her former self. Meanwhile, Mrs. Evelyn Dillard sat quietly in the serene VIP lounge her son had arranged for her. The day's events weighed heavily on her heart. As she sipped her tea, her mind drifted back through time, recalling memories, some painful, others bittersweet. Evelyn had been born in the rural South during an era when segregation was entrenched in the fabric of society. As a young girl, she vividly remembered the stark whites-only signs that barred her and her family from entering certain establishments. She could still feel her mother's firm grasp on her hand as they walked past restaurants they couldn't enter and schools she was forbidden to attend. One memory stood out sharply. She was 9 years old, standing in line at the local general store with her father. She had saved up pennies for weeks to buy a small notebook for her school lessons. When it was their turn, the shopkeeper, a gruff, heavy-set man, snatched the notebook from her hand and growled, "We don't sell to your kind." Evelyn's father, a quiet and dignified man, took her hand gently and led her out of the store without a word. But Evelyn had noticed the tears welling in his eyes, and the image stayed with her. That moment fueled her determination to rise above the prejudice and injustice that seemed inescapable. As Evelyn grew older, the challenges only intensified. She married young, to a kind man named Samuel who shared her dreams of building a better future for their family. Together they worked tirelessly, he as a factory laborer and she as a housekeeper for wealthy families. The work was grueling, and Evelyn often endured the sting of being treated as invisible, or worse, as someone undeserving of basic respect. One day, while working for an especially harsh employer, Evelyn overheard a conversation that cut deeply. The woman of the house, hosting a gathering of friends, had said dismissively, "People like her don't need education or ambition. They're meant to serve, and that's all." Evelyn hadn't said a word, but in her heart she made a solemn promise. "My children will never hear words like these. They will have opportunities I never did. I'll make sure of it." That promise became Evelyn's life's mission. She worked double shifts, sometimes skipping meals to save money for her children's education. She encouraged them to dream big, always reminding them that their worth was not defined by how others saw them, but by their own efforts and integrity. Her son, Marcus Dillard, had been bright and ambitious from the start. Evelyn still remembered the day he came home, beaming with pride, holding a notebook full of airplane sketches. "Mama," he had declared, "I'm going to build planes one day." Evelyn had smiled at him and said, "Then you better work hard, baby. Dreaming is free, but success comes at a price." And work hard he did. Marcus excelled in school, earning scholarships that took him to places Evelyn had only ever read about. He studied aeronautical engineering and business, eventually rising through the ranks of the aviation industry to become the CEO of one of the nation's largest airlines. Marcus never forgot where he came from. At every major milestone, he would say with pride, "This is because of her. My mother's the reason I'm here today." But Evelyn's journey wasn't without heartbreak. Samuel passed away when Marcus was just a teenager, leaving Evelyn to raise their children on her own. Those years were the hardest of her life. Evelyn often worked 3 houses in a single day just to keep food on the table. Yet through it all, she never let her children see her despair. She filled their home with love, laughter, and hope. Every evening she read to them, instilling the values of kindness, perseverance, and faith. Sitting in the tranquil lounge now, Evelyn reflected on how far she and her family had come. Despite the indignity she had endured, she had never let bitterness take root in her heart. Instead, she had always chosen grace and resilience, even in the face of adversity. Today's events had reopened old wounds, making her feel, for a brief moment, like that 9-year-old girl in the general store, unseen, unwelcome, and unworthy. Yet Evelyn reminded herself of something she had taught Marcus long ago. Dignity isn't about how others treat you. It's about how you carry yourself, no matter what. She straightened her posture, took another sip of tea, and let the memories settle. The pain of the past would always be part of her story. But it was not the end of it. Evelyn had faced adversity before and emerged stronger every time. Little did she know, her son was already setting a plan into motion. One that would not only address the injustice she had faced, but also spark change on a scale neither of them could have imagined. It was clear to Marcus Dillard that his mother's mistreatment reflected a much larger issue. Determined to make things right, he sprang into action. The first thing he did was ensure that Evelyn would be on the next available flight, in first class, where she would be treated with the utmost care and respect. Marcus personally contacted the airline staff to ensure she would be welcomed warmly, from the gate to her seat, leaving no detail overlooked in providing for her comfort. At the same time, Marcus composed a heartfelt apology, not just to his mother but to all the passengers who had witnessed the incident. He understood that an injustice like this required a public response. Later that day, SkyNova Airlines released a formal statement. "We deeply regret and apologize for the unacceptable treatment of one of our valued passengers, Mrs. Evelyn Dillard, by a member of our staff. Such behavior does not reflect the values of SkyNova Airlines. We are committed to addressing this incident with the seriousness it deserves, ensuring that no passenger is ever treated with such disrespect again. Effective immediately, the staff member responsible has been terminated, and we are implementing mandatory training for all employees to promote inclusivity, respect, and professionalism. To all passengers on Flight 612, we offer a full refund and a complimentary future flight as compensation for witnessing this distressing incident. To Mrs. Evelyn Dillard, we extend our deepest apologies and promise that this will serve as a turning point for our company. The statement, signed by Marcus Dillard himself, was posted on the airline's website and shared widely on social media. Within minutes, it began gaining attention, but the real explosion came when passengers on the flight started sharing their first-hand accounts. Videos taken on board showed Evelyn's calm dignity as she was escorted off the plane, in stark contrast to Diane's smug, condescending attitude. One passenger, a travel blogger with a large following, uploaded a video titled, "The Strongest Woman I've Ever Met," praising Evelyn's grace under pressure. "This woman was treated so unfairly," the blogger said. "But she held her head high and never let them break her. She's a true inspiration." The video went viral, amassing millions of views within hours. Comments poured in from people around the world. "How could anyone treat such a sweet lady like that? This is exactly what's wrong with society, judging people by appearances. Mrs. Evelyn is a queen. I hope she's okay." News outlets quickly picked up the story. Headlines like, "Airline CEO's Mother Humiliated in Shocking Incident," and "Grace Under Fire, Elderly Woman's Poise Shames Discriminatory Flight Attendant," spread across online platforms and television broadcasts. While Evelyn sat quietly in the VIP lounge, unaware of the growing media storm, Marcus was inundated with calls from journalists and activists. Some demanded further accountability, while others commended his decisive action against Diane. Evelyn's story became a rallying cry for better treatment of passengers, especially those who are often overlooked or underestimated. Advocacy groups praised her as a symbol of quiet strength and resilience. Yet Evelyn remained humble. She hadn't sought attention or accolades. She simply wanted to reach her great-grandchild. When Marcus finally joined her in the lounge, he found her sitting calmly, knitting as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Marcus," she said with a soft smile as he approached, "you didn't have to do all this, you know." "Yes, I did, Mama," Marcus replied, sitting beside her. "What happened to you wasn't right, and it's my responsibility to make sure it never happens again, to you or anyone else." Evelyn sighed gently. "You've always had such a big heart, baby. But remember," she said, her voice steady, "we can't control how others treat us. We can only control how we respond." As always, her words struck a deep chord in Marcus. He nodded, determination shining in his eyes. Evelyn's quiet strength had not only shaped him as a person, but would now guide the changes he planned to make for the airline, and beyond. For a moment, Marcus sat in stunned silence. He had always known his mother to be strong, but this was something else entirely. Evelyn wasn't asking for a symbolic gesture. She was insisting on an active role in transforming the airline, reshaping it into a culture of inclusivity and respect. "I want you to transfer ownership of a major share of the airline to me," Evelyn said, her tone calm but resolute. "I want to be a part of this company, not just in name, but in action. If I'm going to help fix things, I need to have a seat at the table." Marcus could hardly believe his ears. His mother, who had endured so much and never sought recognition, was now asking for a powerful stake in the company he had built. It was a bold request. At first, he didn't know how to respond. But then he thought about everything Evelyn had done for him, every sacrifice she had made to give him opportunities she never had. In that moment, Marcus realized this wasn't just his mother's plea. This was a movement. And if anyone could lead it, it was Evelyn. "Okay, Mama," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "If you're sure this is what you want, I'll make it happen. I'll transfer the shares to you. You'll be a primary stakeholder in the company. You'll have a real voice in how we do things from now on." Evelyn's eyes lit up, and for the first time since the incident, a smile spread across her face. "Thank you, Marcus. I know it's a big step, but I want to be there for the people who need to see change, who need to see that someone cares about them." The following days were a whirlwind. Marcus wasted no time in making the necessary arrangements, legally transferring a significant portion of Skynova Airlines shares to Evelyn. The announcement of her new position as a primary stakeholder sent shockwaves through the company. Some executives were skeptical, wondering if Evelyn, a woman who had spent most of her life outside the corporate world, could navigate the complexities of a global airline. But Marcus stood firmly by his decision. He assured the board that his mother's unique perspective was precisely what the company needed. The media's reaction was equally mixed. Many applauded Evelyn's courage and foresight, calling her a trailblazer in the fight for equality and representation. Others, particularly critics who had sided with Diane Monroe's actions, were less than enthusiastic. But Evelyn wasn't concerned with the critics. She had a mission, and now she had the means to carry it out. As Evelyn embraced her new role as a significant shareholder, she immediately began using her influence to drive systemic change. She advocated for comprehensive training programs on inclusivity and cultural sensitivity for all employees, from flight attendants to pilots to executives. She called for the airline to partner with community organizations to foster diversity and offer scholarships to underrepresented groups pursuing careers in aviation. Evelyn wasn't just taking a seat at the table. She was reshaping the table itself. Her presence was soon felt throughout the company. Employees at all levels began to feel the ripple effects of her leadership. Skynova Airlines was no longer just a company. It was becoming a symbol of transformation. Under Evelyn Dillard's leadership, the changes at Skynova Airlines began to ripple far beyond the company itself. Airlines around the world took notice of the positive shifts happening under her guidance. Customer satisfaction soared as passengers reported feeling more respected and valued. Employees, especially those from marginalized communities, expressed pride in working for a company that was actively making a difference. Evelyn had taken a stand, and now she was paving the way for others to follow. In stark contrast, Diane Monroe's life began to unravel in ways she could never have anticipated. What she initially thought was a minor confrontation on a routine flight snowballed into a scandal that would define her name, and not in a good way. Her disrespectful, discriminatory, and outright cruel behavior struck a nerve with the public, igniting a wave of backlash. The first signs of trouble came when Diane's social media accounts were inundated with angry comments. News articles, videos, and passenger testimonies about her treatment of Evelyn began circulating online. The hashtag Justice for Evelyn trended for days, and Diane's name became synonymous with the very behavior society was striving to eliminate. As the story gained traction, social media users and news outlets dug deeper into Diane's history. They uncovered old posts, photos, and comments that revealed troubling views on race and social class. While these weren't directly related to her actions on the flight, they painted a picture of someone who harbored deep-seated prejudices. Diane's carefully curated public image quickly crumbled. Once viewed as a polished professional, she now faced widespread condemnation. Skynova Airlines, which had been hesitant to take decisive action at first, found itself under mounting pressure to distance itself from Diane. Evelyn's decision to become a shareholder and her bold stance on inclusivity had set a clear tone. There was no room for prejudice in this new vision for the company. Within days, Diane was summoned to a formal meeting with the airline's HR department. The result was swift and unequivocal. She was fired. Her contract was terminated immediately, and the airline made it clear that her actions had not only violated their code of conduct, but also betrayed the values the company now stood for. Despite the gravity of her dismissal, Diane still failed to grasp the full impact of her actions. She attempted to claim that she had been misunderstood, arguing that the situation had been exaggerated. She even tried to paint herself as the victim, citing the pressures of her job. Her defense fell flat. Skynova released a statement emphasizing that her behavior was unacceptable, and the public echoed this sentiment. The story took on a life of its own. Diane was no longer just a flight attendant who mistreated a passenger. She became a symbol of the kind of discrimination society was determined to eradicate. As her termination became public knowledge, Diane's professional prospects dried up almost overnight. Job offers, once plentiful in the travel and hospitality industry, disappeared. She found herself blacklisted by potential employers who didn't want to associate their businesses with someone tied to such a high-profile scandal. Her name became synonymous with the kind of prejudice the public no longer tolerated. Employers viewed her as a liability, unwilling to take the risk of hiring someone so publicly disgraced. The isolation Diane experienced was profound. Friends and acquaintances began to distance themselves, uncomfortable with the controversy surrounding her actions. Diane was forced to confront a harsh reality. Her behavior had consequences far beyond what she had imagined. And while Evelyn's story sparked change and inspired countless others, Diane's became a cautionary tale about the lasting impact of prejudice and cruelty. Diane Monroe had built her life on maintaining a polished image, but now she was living in the aftermath of a reputation irreparably damaged. In a desperate attempt to salvage her career, Diane reached out to professional contacts, hoping to find opportunities in another field. She even considered relocating to a different city, believing a fresh start might help her rebuild. However, the stain of her actions clung to her, following her wherever she went. Meanwhile, Evelyn Dillard, now a prominent figure in Skynova Airlines leadership, had stepped into her role with purpose and conviction. Her vision for the airline was clear, a steadfast commitment to diversity, inclusion, and respect in every aspect of the business. Evelyn's presence at the company's headquarters was more than symbolic. It was a constant reminder of the transformation underway. But it wasn't just her presence or her words that brought about change. It was the decisive actions she took to fulfill her promises. Evelyn implemented policies to prevent discrimination from ever occurring again within the airline. She introduced mandatory training programs focused on cultural sensitivity, unconscious bias, and inclusive communication. She also championed diversity in hiring, ensuring representation across all levels, from pilots and flight attendants to ground crew and executives. More than policies, Evelyn's leadership style became a powerful example of treating people with dignity and respect. Her work demonstrated that fostering respect wasn't about lip service. It required genuine, top-down reform. In her new role, Evelyn also took on public relations, using her platform to address the incident with Diane head-on. During her first public address as part of Skynova's new PR campaign, Evelyn made the airline's stance unequivocally clear. Every individual, regardless of their race, background, or appearance, deserves to be treated with dignity and fairness, Evelyn stated during a press conference. There is no room for disrespect in this world, and there is certainly no room for it on our flights. We stand for equality, and we stand for respect. Her message resonated deeply, not just with the media, but with the public at large. It became clear that this was about more than a single incident on a plane. It marked a fundamental shift in how society approached issues of race, class, and dignity. Evelyn's voice became a beacon of change, inspiring many and positioning Skynova Airlines at the forefront of a movement toward inclusivity in the travel industry. Meanwhile, Diane struggled to grapple with the fallout of her actions. Slowly but surely, she faded from the public eye. Once a part of a powerful system, her legacy became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how quickly prejudice and cruelty could ruin both a career and a reputation. In the end, Evelyn's decision to take action not only changed the course of her own life, but also sparked a broader cultural shift, proving that even the smallest acts of grace and determination could lead to profound and lasting change.
This story reminds us of the importance of standing up against prejudice and embracing kindness. It's a powerful lesson in resilience and holding others accountable for their actions. Let's strive to create a world filled with compassion and understanding. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe to Warming Tales Frias, and share it with others. Thank you for watching, and I wish you all the best. Stay kind and take care.